28 men vanish into the mountains, and for years, the wilderness gets the blame. In the late 1890s, the Ozarks were the perfect place for secrets to survive. Dense forest, scattered settlements, no fast way to call for help. And in a region where trappers disappeared often enough to avoid panic, one pattern stayed invisible for far too long. But what happens when those disappearances stop looking like accidents and start looking like design? This is the case study of a story so disturbing it sounds almost impossible. Two isolated sisters, a remote homestead, a dying survivor, and a hidden system beneath the earth that may have concealed far more than moonshine. Was this a real buried atrocity, a legend sharpened over time, or something in between? To understand it, we have to go back to the mountains first. Before we get into it, if you enjoy deep dive historical case studies told like documentaries, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and drop a comment below. And tell me this, where are you watching from? I always love seeing how far these stories travel. In 1897, the Ozark region of Newton County, Arkansas, was the kind of place that could make a person feel very small. Not poetic small, vulnerable small. The mountains rose in thick layers of oak and hickory, the valleys stayed dim even at midday, and settlements were so scattered they barely felt connected to one another. No fast roads, no telegraph lines tying everyone together, no nearby sheriff's office ready to respond when something went wrong. And that mattered, because in country like this, things went wrong all the time. Men slipped from cliffs, froze in sudden weather, got turned around in rough timber, or simply never came back. So when trappers began disappearing in this part of the Ozarks, nobody immediately saw mystery. They saw the mountains doing what mountains do. That's what made the setting so dangerous. The landscape didn't just hide bodies. It hid patterns. It gave every missing man a ready-made explanation before anyone even bothered to ask a harder question. What if these men weren't being swallowed by nature at all? What if someone understood this terrain so well that they used it like camouflage? In that world, isolation wasn't just a backdrop. It was cover. And for families scraping by after the Civil War had left the region underbuilt and cut off, fur trapping remained one of the few dependable ways to make cash. Every autumn, experienced woodsmen moved into the valleys along the Buffalo River system looking for beaver, mink, and otter pelts they could sell at small trading posts. That seasonal movement of solitary men into remote country created the perfect blind spot. A trapper could enter the forest with skill, supplies, and years of experience, and still vanish so completely that even his loved ones might spend months telling themselves he had simply stayed longer, gone west, or started over somewhere else. And sitting inside that blind spot, almost unnoticed, was a homestead that locals considered strange but not alarming. The Caldwell sisters, Mercy and Temperance, lived on land inherited from their father, Josiah Caldwell, a moonshiner who had operated deep in a hollow roughly 15 miles from the nearest settlement. After his death in 1895, the sisters stayed on the property and continued producing illegal whiskey, which in a place this isolated was hardly enough by itself to make them infamous. Remote mountain families often looked eccentric to outsiders. That alone proved nothing. Still, small details had a way of lingering in people's memory. A traveling peddler named James Whitmore later recalled the sisters' weathered cabin, the outbuildings on it, and what looked like root cellars carved into the hillside behind the house. Mercy handled business. Temperance stayed quiet, watching with the kind of intensity that made a visitor want to leave sooner rather than later. More curious than that, though, was what they bought. Despite appearing poor, the sisters paid in silver and purchased expensive fabric, quality tools, heavy chain, and metal hardware. Mercy explained it away as practical mountain need, the sort of thing required to protect livestock from predators. And honestly, in that time and place, who was going to press too hard? That is how unsettling stories begin, isn't it? Not with one giant red flag waving in the air, but with a collection of odd little details that each seem explainable on their own. A hidden hollow. A family used to isolation. Goods that didn't quite match the life being presented. Doors in the hillside that looked easy to dismiss until much later. It's only after the pattern comes into focus that everyone says the same thing. The signs were there. The first disappearance linked to this territory came in October 1897, when a trapper named Robert Finch failed to return from a seasonal expedition along the Buffalo River. His family waited through winter, assuming he had extended the trip or moved on in search of better opportunity. That assumption tells you everything about the era. Vanishing wasn't normal, exactly, but it was believable. By the spring of 1899, 7 experienced trappers had disappeared in the same general area, all men familiar with wilderness survival, all men who should have known how to avoid the most common dangers of the Ozarks. More importantly, they left behind almost nothing. No campsites, no equipment, no remains, no clean explanation. That absence began to bother Deputy Sheriff Ezra Thornton, a Civil War veteran with years in law enforcement and a habit of distrusting convenient answers. He reviewed the missing reports, mapped the last known locations, and saw what others had failed to see. This wasn't random. It clustered around one stretch of wilderness, roughly 15 miles southeast of Parthenon, near the Caldwell land. Local trappers had started avoiding the area, though few could say exactly why beyond a vague feeling that something was wrong there. That's the psychological hinge of this case. Long before people can prove danger, they often feel it. Thornton did what nobody else had done seriously enough. He treated the disappearances as connected, and once that shift happens, the whole story changes. The mountain stops looking like the killer. It starts looking like the curtain, and behind that curtain, waiting in the hollow, was a truth far darker than anyone in Newton County was prepared to imagine. By the time people in Newton County began saying the Caldwell name with a lower voice and a longer pause, the sisters had already spent years turning distance into protection. Mercy Caldwell, the elder of the two, was described as controlled, practical, and unusually calm under pressure. She was the one who spoke to traders, handled money, and decided how much of the family's business outsiders were allowed to see. Temperance, younger and far less social, and settled people in a different way. She did not need to say much. In fact, that may have been part of what made her memorable. Visitors later described her as watchful, silent, and hard to read, the kind of person who seemed to be studying you even while standing perfectly still. Together, they formed a strange balance that made the homestead feel closed off, almost self-sealed. And that mattered, because in isolated mountain communities, reputation was often built less on scandal than on rhythm. Who came and went? Who joined church? Who traded often? Who attended burials, weddings, harvests, and disputes? The Caldwell sisters did almost none of that. They stayed in their hollow, sold liquor when it suited them, bought what they needed, and kept the rest of their lives hidden behind timber and slope. On paper, that was not a crime. In practice, it made them impossible to read. Their father, Josiah Caldwell, had already given the property a reputation before his daughters inherited it. He had run moonshine from the mountains for years, using the terrain to keep lawmen at a distance and strangers off balance. Hidden routes, buried stores, Blackwood familiarity with every ravine and ridgeline, those were the real assets being passed down, maybe even more than the land itself. So after his death in 1895, the sisters did not just inherit a cabin. They inherited a working system of concealment. That is what makes this part of the case so fascinating and so disturbing. The story does not begin with chaos. It begins with infrastructure, with routines, with knowledge already in place. And once you start looking at it that way, the Caldwell property stops feeling like a lonely family home and starts feeling more like a machine built for privacy. But privacy alone does not create fear. What transformed the sisters from local oddities into figures of whispered suspicion were the contradictions. The first was money. The homestead looked poor, weather-beaten cabin, rough clothing. No visible signs of prosperity, yet merchants noticed that the sisters could pay in hard silver and were willing to spend it on items that did not quite fit the image they projected. Not luxuries, exactly. More like durable, purposeful supplies, iron hardware, chain, reinforced tools, heavy locks, fabric in larger quantities than expected, medicinal stock, lamp oil, and provisions that seemed excessive for two women living alone in the hills. Each purchase had an explanation: livestock, winter preparation, repairs, a bigger wash cycle than usual. And because frontier life often required hoarding whatever was available when you had the chance, nobody could point to one item and say, "There, that proves it." Still, taken together, the pattern felt off. Then there was the land itself. Travelers and traders remembered outbuildings and cellar-like structures carved into the slope behind the house, features easy to dismiss in a region where root storage, storm shelter, and hidden whiskey caches were all common enough. But the Caldwell property seemed to have more of them than a normal family would need, and the sisters were oddly protective of the hillside. They discouraged wandering. They redirected questions. They always seemed to know where a visitor was standing and where they were looking. Even their hospitality felt strategic. Mercy could be polite when it served her, but never warm, never inviting. Just enough civility to keep suspicion from turning into accusation. And that may be the most unsettling detail of all. Nothing about the sisters, at least in these early accounts, was flamboyantly monstrous. There were no dramatic outbursts, no obvious confessions hidden in plain sight. Just composure, secrecy, control. The kind of control that makes people second-guess their own instincts. You leave feeling uneasy, but you cannot yet say why. And that is exactly how dangerous people often survive in communities built on informality, by staying just inside the border of the explainable. What nobody fully understood yet was how isolation can turn a family inward until their logic stops resembling everyone else's. The Caldwell sisters were not merely secluded, they were socially and morally unobserved. No regular contact with church elders. No meaningful scrutiny from neighbors. No trusted relatives moving in and out often enough to notice changes. In a modern setting, that kind of disappearance from public life might stand out immediately. In the Ozarks of the 1890s, it could be mistaken for independence. Frontier culture respected self-sufficiency, sometimes to a fault. If a household kept to itself, worked its land, and caused no openly visible conflict, most people preferred not to interfere. Add in gender expectations, and the blind spot becomes even larger. To women alone in the mountains did not fit the image of organized physical threat that late 19th century authorities were trained to imagine. They could be pitied, gossiped about, even mocked, but feared in a serious investigative sense. Not at first. And that is one reason the legend of the Ozark sisters became so powerful later on. It overturned assumptions people did not even realize they had. Beneath the curiosity of the story sits a harder truth. Danger is often missed when it arrives in a form society is not prepared to suspect. As more men went missing, the Caldwells remained on the edge of the story, visible, but never centered. Yet slowly, the hollow around them began to feel less like background and more like gravity, pulling every unanswered question toward it. Traders remembered the hard stares. Locals remembered avoiding the road near the property after dark. Men who trapped nearby spoke of the uneasy silence in that stretch of mountain, as if even the ordinary sounds of the forest seemed to thin out there. Superstition, maybe. Or maybe the human mind notices patterns before it can articulate them. Either way, the women in the hollow were no longer just strange. They were becoming the still point in a widening circle of dread.
At first, the disappearances didn't feel connected. They felt like the kind of unfortunate events people in the Ozarks had learned to accept. A man goes out trapping, doesn't return on time, and the assumption settles in quietly. He got lost, injured, or decided to move on. That was the rhythm of the frontier. But patterns don't announce themselves loudly. They build slowly, almost invisibly, until someone decides to line the events up side by side. Between late 1897 and early 1899, more men failed to come back from the same stretch of wilderness. Not amateurs, not drifters with no experience. These were seasoned trappers, men who understood terrain, weather, and survival better than most. And that detail mattered. Because when experienced woodsmen start vanishing without leaving behind tools, campsites, or even partial traces, it stops feeling like bad luck. It starts feeling like removal, like something or someone is intervening in a way that leaves no residue behind. Still, for a long time, nobody framed it that way. Families waited longer than they should have. Reports came in late, if at all, and by the time concern turned into quiet alarm, the trail had already gone cold. What began to shift the tone wasn't just the number of missing men, it was how similar their last known movements were. When Deputy Ezra Thornton finally reviewed the cases together, he noticed something others had overlooked. The disappearances weren't scattered randomly across the region. They clustered, a defined area, not a general wilderness. That distinction changed everything. Instead of asking, what dangers exist in these mountains, Thornton began asking, what exists in this specific place. He retraced routes, spoke with traders, compared dates, and built a rough map of last sightings. Again and again, the same boundary appeared, a region within reach of the Caldwell homestead, not directly at their doorstep, not close enough to be obvious, but near enough to matter. And once that realization took hold, even small details started to feel heavier. A traplin abandoned mid-route, a mule found wandering without its handler, supplies left unused. It wasn't just that men were disappearing. It was that they were being interrupted, stopped in the middle of their routines. And that's a very different kind of story, because accidents don't usually interrupt patterns so cleanly. They scatter things. They leave chaos. This felt precise, almost controlled, as if something understood the habits of these men and acted within that understanding. Then came the part that no one could comfortably explain away: the absence of evidence itself. In most wilderness disappearances, something is eventually found. A torn pack, a rusted trap, a shallow grave uncovered by animals. But here, there was almost nothing. It was as if the men had stepped into a space where traces didn't survive. That kind of absence doesn't just frustrate an investigation, it reshapes it. It forces a question that people are often reluctant to ask: what kind of environment, or what kind of system, can remove not only a person, but the signs they were ever there? Thornton wasn't dealing with coincidence anymore. He was dealing with consistency. And consistency, in cases like this, usually points toward intention. Meanwhile, the local reaction followed a familiar psychological pattern. Some people doubled down on natural explanations, insisting the mountains were unpredictable enough to account for everything. Others leaned toward rumor, whispering about something unnatural in that part of the forest. But very few were ready to consider a grounded, human explanation, because that would mean accepting that someone was operating within the community's blind spot, using isolation as a tool, and that is always harder to face than blaming the wilderness. Still, avoidance only works for so long. By early 1899, with multiple cases aligning too closely to ignored, the question was no longer whether something was wrong. The question was where to look first. And every line Thornton drew, every story he cross-checked, kept pulling him back to the same quiet, isolated hollow. The same land. The same sisters. Not as proven suspects, not yet, but as the one constant in a pattern that was no longer random. And once a pattern stops looking random, the next step becomes inevitable. Someone has to go and see for themselves. Ezra Thornton was not the kind of man easily impressed by rumor or easily comforted by simple explanations. A Civil War veteran turned deputy sheriff, he had spent years dealing with disputes, theft, and the quiet kinds of violence that never made headlines but shaped communities all the same. He understood how fear could distort facts, but he also understood something just as important. When people lean too quickly on accident as an answer, it often means they're avoiding a harder truth. By early 1899, Thornton had seen enough to know the disappearances in Newton County didn't fit the usual patterns. Too clean, too consistent, too concentrated in one stretch of land, and perhaps most importantly, too easily dismissed by everyone else. That bothered him, because in his experience, real danger often hides behind the explanations people want to believe. So, instead of treating each missing trapper as an isolated case, Thornton did something simple but powerful. He treated them as connected events. He began compiling timelines, mapping locations, and interviewing anyone who had crossed paths with the missing men. It wasn't a formal investigation in the modern sense. No forensic teams, no centralized records, just a man with experience, intuition, and the patience to sit with uncomfortable questions longer than others were willing to. What Thornton found wasn't dramatic at first, it was subtle. Patterns rarely announce themselves. Loudly, they whisper, and what he heard, again and again, were echoes of the same story told in slightly different ways. A trapper seen heading toward a familiar route, then never returning. Another last spotted trading supplies before heading into the same general territory. A third who mentioned avoiding a certain stretch of woods, but couldn't explain why. Each detail on its own meant very little. Together, they began to form a shape. Thornton sketched rough maps, marking last known sightings, estimated routes, and the natural corridors trappers would use when moving through the region. And there it was, that tightening circle, not spread across the Ozarks, but narrowing toward a specific zone, a hollow, a piece of land tied, directly or indirectly, to the Caldwell property. Now, Thornton wasn't reckless. He didn't jump straight to accusation. In fact, his first instinct was to test every natural explanation thoroughly. Predators? Unlikely at this scale, and they would leave evidence. Terrain hazards? Possible, but not consistently in the same location without traces. Banditry? That would leave rumors, stolen goods surfacing somewhere, signs of struggle. None of those explanations held up cleanly, and when every common answer begins to fail, what remains, no matter how uncomfortable, demands attention. That's where Thornton's mindset set him apart. He didn't need proof yet. He needed enough inconsistency to justify a closer look, and, by that point, he had more than enough. Still, pushing an investigation forward in a place like Newton County wasn't easy. Authority wasn't centralized, and resources were thin. Convincing others that something deliberate might be happening required more than instinct, it required risk. Because if Thornton was wrong, he wasn't just chasing shadows, he was accusing neighbors, stirring fear, and potentially damaging reputations without cause. That's the tension at the heart of early investigations like this. Move too slowly, and you miss the truth entirely. Move too quickly, and you create panic where none exists. Thornton chose a middle path. He began quietly pressing for a closer look at the Caldwell property, not as a raid, not as a confrontation, but as a visit, a conversation, an observation, something that could either confirm his suspicions or put them to rest. And even that small step carried weight. Because, once you decide to look directly at something others have avoided, you change the trajectory of the entire story. You stop accepting the mountain as the answer. You start asking what the mountain might be hiding. And that shift from passive acceptance to active inquiry is often the moment when cases like this begin to unravel. Thornton didn't yet know what he would find in that hollow. But he knew one thing with certainty: the pattern he was seeing wasn't natural. And if it wasn't natural, then someone, somewhere within that landscape, understood exactly what was happening. The question was whether they would still be there when he arrived, or whether the silence of the mountains would try, once again, to swallow the truth before it could surface. When Ezra Thornton finally made the decision to visit the Caldwell property, he did not go in with force. That's important. There was no warrant, no formal accusation, just a calculated step forward based on growing unease. In a place like Newton County, walking onto someone's land uninvited carried its own risks, social and otherwise. So Thornton approached it the only way that made sense at the time, as a routine check, a quiet extension of his inquiries into the missing trappers. The journey itself reinforced everything he had been thinking. The further he moved away from settled paths, the more the landscape seemed to close in. Trails narrowed, visibility dropped, and a feeling of being watched, whether real or imagined, settled in. This wasn't just remote land. It was deliberately isolating terrain. By the time the Caldwell homestead came into view, it didn't feel like stumbling upon a home. It felt like reaching something that had been placed exactly where it couldn't be easily observed. The cabin stood worn but intact, surrounded by a few outbuildings, tools, and signs of self-sufficiency. Nothing overtly alarming, nothing that would justify immediate action, and yet, as Thornton later reflected, there was a stillness to the place that didn't feel natural, not peaceful stillness, controlled stillness, the kind where every movement seems measured, every detail accounted for. Mercy Caldwell was the one who greeted him, calm, composed, and exactly as described by others who had met her before. She didn't act surprised to see him, which in itself was notable given how rarely outsiders came through that hollow. Thornton introduced himself, explained his purpose in general terms, and asked a few questions about recent activity in the area. Missing men, unusual sightings, anything out of place. Mercy answered smoothly. Too smoothly, perhaps. Her responses were consistent with what one might expect. She had seen travelers pass through from time to time, couldn't say where they went after, and had no knowledge of anyone disappearing nearby. It was all reasonable, all defensible, and yet something didn't sit right. Not in what she said, but in how little variation there was in her tone. No hesitation, no curiosity about the investigation, no emotional reaction to the idea that multiple men had vanished within reach of her land. Just controlled acknowledgement. Meanwhile, Temperance remained in the background, watching, not participating, not interrupting, just observing with a fixed intensity that Thornton could not ignore. It created a subtle imbalance in the interaction. Mercy spoke, but Temperance anchored the silence, and that silence began to feel heavier the longer Thornton stayed. He asked about the property itself, livestock, storage, outbuildings. Mercy offered short, direct answers, even gesturing towards certain areas as if to demonstrate transparency. But there were limits. The hillside behind the cabin, where those cellar-like structures were rumored to be, was acknowledged only vaguely. Storage, she called it, root cellars, supplies, necessary things for surviving harsh winters in isolation. Again, nothing that could be challenged outright. But Thornton noticed something else. She didn't invite inspection. She didn't say, "You can take a look." She simply explained and moved on. And in investigations, what people don't offer often matters as much as what they do. As the visit continued, Thornton shifted from conversation to observation. Small details, ground conditions, movement patterns, signs of recent activity. He noted the layout of the land, the positioning of structures, the way paths connected or didn't. And while nothing presented itself as immediate evidence of wrongdoing, the overall impression grew more troubling, not less. There was an efficiency to the property, a sense that everything had a purpose beyond what was visible on the surface. Even the absence of certain things stood out. No wandering livestock despite claims of managing them. No signs of frequent visitors despite operating a liquor trade. No casual disorder that typically accompanies isolated homesteads. Instead, it felt contained, managed, almost as if the chaos of the outside world stopped at the boundary of that land and was replaced by something far more controlled. Before leaving, Thornton made a deliberate choice. He didn't push the hard not yet. He thanked Mercy, acknowledged her time, and stepped away without confrontation. On paper, the visit had yielded nothing actionable. No confession. No physical evidence. No immediate cause to escalate. But internally, the effect was the opposite. The encounter didn't reduce suspicion, it refined it. It turned a vague pattern into a focused concern. Because sometimes, the most telling part of an investigation isn't what you find. It's what you feel when everything appears just normal enough to avoid scrutiny. As Thornton made his way back through the trees, one thought stayed with him, steady and unresolved. If nothing was wrong at that homestead, then why did everything about it feel so carefully controlled? And if something was being controlled, what exactly was it? Up to this point, everything in the case rested on absence, missing men, missing evidence, missing explanations, and absence, by its nature, is difficult to prove. It leaves room for doubt, for alternative theories, for the kind of hesitation that slows action. But in April of 1899, that changed. Because for the first time, something didn't disappear. Something came back. His name was Samuel Morrison, a trapper who had been missing for nearly 3 weeks. When he emerged near a small settlement at the edge of the Ozarks, he didn't arrive like a man returning from the wilderness. He arrived like someone who had escaped it. Exhausted, barely able to stand, his body marked by dehydration, injury, and something harder to define, shock, perhaps, or the aftereffects of prolonged confinement. Witnesses later described him as disoriented, struggling to speak clearly, collapsing shortly after reaching help. And that detail matters, because whatever Morrison experienced, it wasn't something he could easily articulate, not at first, not cleanly, which only made what he eventually said more unsettling. Because when someone in that condition begins to describe a place, a system, something structured rather than chaotic, people start listening differently. As Morrison recovered enough to speak, his account began in fragments, disconnected pieces that had to be assembled carefully. He described being approached while checking trap lines, taken by surprise, overpowered before he could react, not by a faceless group, by individuals. That alone shifted the entire narrative. This wasn't the wilderness claiming lives. This was direct human action. He spoke of being transported, though he wasn't sure how far or for how long, before being confined in what he described as an underground space. Dark, restricted. Not a natural cave, but something modified, shaped, or expanded with purpose. That detail aligned uncomfortably with earlier descriptions of the Caldwell property and its hillside structures. According to Morrison, he wasn't alone. He recalled hearing others' voices, movement, signs of multiple captives kept in separate but connected spaces. He couldn't give exact numbers, couldn't describe every detail with precision. But the consistency in his account was what gave it weight. This wasn't a single moment of violence, followed by abandonment. It was containment, ongoing, organized, and intentional. When asked about his captors, Morrison's responses grew more strained. He identified them not as strangers, but as the women associated with the isolated homestead, the Caldwell sisters. Mercy, he said, handled interaction. Temperance remained mostly silent. The same dynamic others had described, now placed inside a far more disturbing context. And perhaps most chilling of all, Morrison insisted that what was happening wasn't random cruelty. It was structured behavior justified, in the minds of those carrying it out, by a belief system he struggled to fully explain. That part of his testimony would later become one of the most debated elements of the entire case. His escape, as he described it, wasn't the result of rescue or oversight, it was opportunity. A lapse, a moment where control faltered just enough for him to act. He didn't claim strength or strategy beyond desperation. He simply saw a chance and took it, navigating through darkness, disorientation, and terrain he could barely recognize until he reached open ground. And even then, survival wasn't guaranteed. The distance he traveled in that condition, without proper food or direction, suggests something deeper than physical endurance. It suggests urgency driven by fear. Because people don't push themselves that far unless they believe staying where they were is worse than anything waiting outside. By the time Morrison's account reached Deputy Thornton, the case crossed a line it could not return from. This was no longer a pattern of disappearances. It was a direct allegation of organized captivity, of intentional harm, of a system operating in isolation shielded by geography and dismissed by assumption. And with that shift came pressure to act, to verify, to confront what might be hidden beneath the surface of that quiet hollow. Of course, not everyone accepted Morrison's story immediately. Some questioned his mental state, his injuries, the reliability of a man emerging from extreme conditions. That skepticism is natural, but Thornton saw something else. Not perfection in the account but alignment. Alignment with the pattern he had already identified. Alignment with the inconsistencies he couldn't ignore. And sometimes, in investigations like this, you don't need a flawless story. You need one that fits the pieces already on the table. Morrison's did. And that meant the next step could no longer be cautious observation. It had to be action. Because if even part of what he described was true, then somewhere in that mountain hollow, others might still be waiting. Once Samuel Morrison's account reached Deputy Ezra Thornton, hesitation became its own kind of danger. Up to that moment, the investigation had lived in a gray zone, strong suspicion, troubling patterns, but nothing solid enough to force immediate action. Morrison changed that. His testimony did not answer every question, but it made inaction far harder to justify. If he was telling the truth, then this was no longer about missing persons in the abstract. It was about people who might still be alive, hidden somewhere beneath or around the Caldwell property. Thornton pushed for a search party, but even then, the response was not instant or unified. That's one of the most revealing parts of cases like this. People like to imagine that once evidence appears, everyone moves quickly and clearly toward the truth. Real life rarely works that way. Officials worried about acting on the word of a traumatized survivor. Others feared walking armed men into remote private land without airtight proof. And then there was the quieter resistance, the psychological kind, because once you accept that, Morrison might be right. You also have to accept that something systematic and deeply disturbing has been happening in plain reach of the community. That is a hard thing for any town to face. Still, Thornton kept pressing. He argued that the pattern, the location cluster, his earlier visit, and now Morrison's testimony all pointed to the same conclusion. The hollow had to be searched. Eventually, a small party was assembled, local lawmen and armed volunteers. The kind of improvised force frontier justice often relied on when official resources ran thin. They moved toward the property with urgency, but not recklessness. Every man knew the terrain favored whoever already lived there. Every ridge, tree line, and hollow could be used as cover. This wasn't a march toward certainty. It was a descent into it. As the search party approached the Caldwell land, the atmosphere changed in a way several later accounts would emphasize. The forest seemed unnaturally still, as though even the ordinary sounds of birds and insects had thinned out around the property. Now, that may sound like dramatic hindsight, but fear has a way of sharpening environmental memory. People remember silence when they're walking towards something they don't fully understand. The cabin came into view much as Thornton had seen it before, outwardly plain, isolated, and almost offensively normal. That normalcy mattered. It forced the men to confront a tension that runs through so many dark historical cases. The most horrifying things are often hidden behind ordinary surfaces. Thornton called out first, giving the occupants a chance to respond. What followed depends on which version of the account you emphasize, but across retellings, one point remains consistent. The sisters did not react like startled innocents caught in misunderstanding. There was resistance. Whether verbal, physical, or both, the confrontation quickly moved beyond polite inquiry. Mercy attempted to control the exchange, speaking with the same measured composure Thornton had encountered before, but the mood had changed. Morrison's account had stripped away the benefit of the doubt. The search party began inspecting the grounds, moving past the cabin toward the hillside storage structures that had long drawn suspicion. And that is where the scene started to fracture. Hidden entrances, reinforced doors, signs that what had been described as simple cellar space extended farther than ordinary storage would require. Not one crude pit, Not one accidental cavity in the earth, but a network of enclosed spaces suggesting adaptation over time. That detail is critical, because it implies intention, labor, and continuity. Whatever the sisters had built or inherited and expanded was not improvised overnight. It had function. It had design. And once the men saw that, the entire emotional logic of the raid changed. They were no longer checking a theory. They were entering a place that seemed built to keep secrets below ground. The descent itself, in later retellings, becomes the moment the story crosses from suspicion into horror. Lantern light pushing against close darkness, damp air, narrow passages giving way to chambers that felt less like root storage and more like confinement. Some details in these accounts are difficult to verify cleanly, and as a case study, that matters we have to separate dramatic embellishment from the core investigative claim. But even in the most restrained reconstruction, the same conclusion emerges. The search party believed they had found evidence that Morrison's story was not a delirious invention. They found enough structural evidence, signs of occupation, indicators of restraint or containment to confirm that the property concealed something far more sinister than moonshine or survival storage. And psychologically, that must have been a shattering moment. Imagine walking into a place you already fear, hoping part of you is wrong, then realizing the truth may be worse than your suspicion allowed. That is the emotional engine of this chapter. Not just the discovery itself, but the collapse of denial. For Thornton, it meant the pattern he had followed into the mountains was real. For the volunteers, it meant they were standing inside the hidden center of a long-running nightmare. And for the case as a whole, it marked a point of no return. The hollow was no longer just a location linked to rumors and missing men. It had become the scene. The mountain had opened, just enough to show that its silence had never been empty. It had been occupied, controlled, used, and what lay further inside would determine whether this story remained a grim local crime or transformed into one of the darkest legends ever tied to the Appalachian frontier. What the search party found beneath the Caldwell property was not chaos. That may be the most disturbing detail of all. It was structure. A carved passage descending through bedrock, branching into multiple chambers, some fitted with crude bedding, others with restraints fixed directly into stone. The air itself told part of the story before anyone could fully absorb the visual evidence. Stale, foul, unmistakably lived in, and unmistakably wrong. In one chamber, they found 3 surviving children, all very young, huddled in darkness, malnourished, frightened, and so cut off from ordinary human life that even torchlight seemed to terrify them. That discovery alone transformed the case from a grim missing person investigation into something much larger and far harder to process. Because children in that condition do not appear by accident. They are the result of prolonged concealment, prolonged neglect, and a hidden environment maintained over time. And beyond those living chambers, the deeper spaces revealed something even heavier, burial areas containing the remains of multiple victims. Enough to confirm that Samuel Morrison's testimony had not been fevered invention, but a desperate warning grounded in reality. Thornton's documentation reportedly counted 28 bodies or partial remains in various stages of decomposition, suggesting the operation had been active for years rather than months. Some victims could be tentatively identified through personal effects, linking the underground chambers to the names that had accumulated in missing person reports across the region. At that point, the mountain stopped being a place of rumor. It became evidence. And then there was the material that explained the logic behind it all. During the search of the main cabin, investigators reportedly found Mercy Caldwell's written records hidden in the lining of a quilt, pages of diary entries that, if authentic, gave the case its most chilling internal voice. According to the transcript, the diary did not read like the writings of someone confused about what she had done. It read like justification, dates, descriptions, selection criteria, Religious language woven into a private system of meaning that reframed captivity as purpose and cruelty as duty. That is the psychological core of this case. And it matters just as much as the physical evidence, because horrors of this scale rarely survive on brutality alone. They survive on rationalization, on a closed moral universe where the perpetrators no longer see themselves as criminals, but as guardians of some distorted mission. In the Caldwell case, that mission was described as preserving a pure mountain bloodline, a belief the transcript links to scripture, isolation, and a worldview that had hardened beyond correction. If that sounds monstrous, it should, but what makes it historically interesting beyond the horror is how familiar the pattern is. Isolation narrows accountability, belief hardens into certainty, secrecy removes contradiction, and once nobody from the outside is regularly present to challenge the internal logic, even the unthinkable can start to feel, to the people inside that system, not only permissible but necessary. That does not excuse anything. It explains how such a hidden world can sustain itself long enough to create victims, routines, and even records without collapsing under its own madness. The emotional weight of this chapter, though, is not only in what was discovered. It is in what those discoveries say about time. Think about that for a second. 28 missing men across several years, children raised underground, chambers adapted for long-term concealment, written records. None of that suggests a sudden break from sanity. It suggests continuity, repetition, a system refined by practice. And that is what makes the underground complex so central to the case study. It wasn't merely a hiding place. It was the physical proof that this story, whether told later as legend, crime account, or frontier nightmare, was built around method. The sisters had taken the geography of the Ozarks, the assumptions of the surrounding community, and the invisibility granted by distance, and turned them into operational advantages. The mountain shielded them, the air shielded them, social assumptions shielded them, and underground, all of those protections became architecture. By the time Thornton and the marshals emerged from those chambers, the meaning of every earlier clue had changed. The heavy chains purchased in town, the silver spent on hardware, the doors built into the rock face, the strange calm of Mercy's explanations, the silence of Temperance, the missing men who seemed to leave no trace. Suddenly, each detail snapped into place with horrifying precision. This is also the point in the narrative where the story stops being merely suspenseful and becomes tragic in a broader historical sense. Because the victims were not only the people found below ground. The victims also include the families who waited for answers, the community that mistook pattern for bad luck, and perhaps even the truth itself, which had to survive in fragments through a dying man's testimony, a deputy's persistence, and the physical evidence hidden beneath a hillside. Once the underground chambers were opened, denial was no longer possible. The only question left was what a community does after discovering that the worst rumors were still too small for the reality they concealed. Once the immediate shock of discovery settled, the case entered a different phase, one that was less about what happened and more about how something like this could happen at all. Because finding evidence answers only part of the story, the harder question lingers underneath. What kind of thinking sustains a system like this over years without collapsing? In the Caldwell case, investigators and later accounts pointed toward a convergence of three powerful forces: extreme isolation, unchecked authority within a closed household, and a belief system that gradually detached from shared reality. Frontier isolation in the late 19th century was not just geographic. It was informational and moral, without consistent contact with broader institutions, church, law, education. Beliefs could evolve without correction. Ideas that might have been challenged or softened in a connected community instead hardened in place. Over time, they stop feeling like opinions and start feeling like absolute truth. And when that happens inside a small, self-contained environment, the rules governing behavior can drift far beyond what the outside world would recognize. That drift is rarely sudden. It is gradual, almost invisible from within. Which is why, from the outside, it feels so shocking when it's finally exposed. In Mercy Caldwell's reported writings, that drift appears as justification layered over time. Not chaos, not confusion, structure, a framework where actions that would be universally condemned elsewhere were reframed as necessary, even righteous, within the logic of the system she believed in. That's a pattern seen in multiple historical cases of extreme isolation, whether religious, ideological, or familial. The human mind is remarkably capable of building internal consistency, even around deeply harmful behavior, as long as it is not forced to confront contradiction. And contradiction requires contact with other people, other ideas, other norms. Remove that contact, and the feedback loop closes. In that closed loop, Mercy's role becomes clearer. She wasn't simply acting, she was interpreting, defining, maintaining a worldview that justified continued action. Temperance, quieter and less outwardly expressive, function within that same system, reinforcing it through participation rather than explanation. Together, they formed a closed authority structure with no external oversight. And once such a structure stabilizes, it becomes self-sustaining. Each action reinforces the belief. Each belief justifies the next action. Over time, the system no longer feels like a choice, it feels like inevitability. That's the psychological engine behind what happened in that hollow. Not randomness, not momentary cruelty, but a sustained internal logic that removed ordinary moral boundaries and replaced them with something entirely self-defined. But understanding that logic does not make the case less disturbing, it makes it more precise, because it shows how environment and mindset can interact in ways that allow extreme outcomes to develop. Quietly, the Ozark landscape provided physical cover, yes, but the social environment provided something just as important: invisibility through assumption. Neighbors assumed the mountains were dangerous enough to explain disappearances. Authorities assumed isolated women did not fit the profile of organized threat. Traders assumed unusual purchases had ordinary explanations. Each assumption, reasonable on its own, created a wider blind spot when combined. And within that blind spot, the Caldwell system operated undetected. That's the broader lesson this case leaves behind. Not just about one place or one family, but about how easily patterns can be missed when they don't match expectations. It raises an uncomfortable question: how many warning signs were seen, but not interpreted? How many moments of unease were dismissed because they didn't form a complete picture yet? Thornton's investigation worked because he challenged those assumptions, because he was willing to look at the same facts others saw and ask a different question. Not what's the easiest explanation, but what explanation actually fits all of this. And once he did that, the story changed. As we move into the final chapter, that shift becomes the focus, not just what was uncovered, but how the story of the Ozark sisters moved beyond the case itself, transforming into something that still lingers today. A legend, yes, but one rooted in a pattern that, once seen clearly, is difficult to forget. By the end of the Caldwell investigation, the community was left with two burdens at once: the reality of what had been uncovered, and the difficulty of fully containing that reality within the neat boundaries of official history. That's often what happens with cases that sit at the edge of horror and folklore. The facts are disturbing enough on their own, but the human mind keeps circling them, adding emphasis here, silence there, until the case begins to live two lives at once. One life belongs to records, testimony, and physical evidence. The other belongs to retelling, to the way a community remembers something too dark to process directly. And the story of the Ozark sisters seems to have followed exactly that path. On one level, it can be approached as a frontier criminal case: missing men, a survivor's testimony, a deputy who followed a pattern others missed, and a remote property hiding evidence of long-term captivity and death. But on another level, it became something larger and more haunting, a cautionary mountain story about isolation, secrecy, and the terrifying idea that evil can settle quietly into a place until the place itself seems to absorb it. That dual identity is a big part of why the case endures, because people are drawn not only to what happened, but to the uneasy border between documented event and remembered nightmare. The more disturbing the truth, the more legend grows around, and not always to distort it, but sometimes simply to carry the emotional weight facts alone cannot hold. In communities shaped by oral history, that process is especially powerful. Details become sharper, then blurrier. Some elements get repeated because they are verifiable. Others survive because they feel true, even when the paper trail is thin. And that, honestly, is what makes this final part so important. Not just asking, did every reported detail happen exactly as later versions describe, but asking a more mature historical question: why did this story stay alive, and what does that persistence tell us? Because stories do not survive for generations by accident. They survive because they attach themselves to fears people recognize, immediately: being isolated, being unseen, being trapped inside a system no one notices until it is far too late. That does not mean every retelling should be accepted uncritically. In fact, the opposite is true. The strongest way to approach a case like this is to hold two thoughts at once. First, the core narrative carries a powerful internal coherence. Repeated disappearances, clustered geography, survivor testimony, hidden chambers, recovered remains, and written material pointing to motive and ideology. Those elements create a structure that feels more grounded than a random campfire tale. But, second, cases that become legendary almost always attract embellishment over time. Numbers grow more exact, dialogue becomes more polished, scenes become more cinematic than memory usually allows. This is where careful case study framing matters. It lets us respect the gravity of the story without pretending every surviving detail is equally certain. And that restraint actually makes the story more compelling, not less. Because even if you strip away every dramatic flourish added over the years, what remains is still deeply unsettling: a remote household operating inside the blind spots of its era, a landscape that disguised pattern as accident, and a chain of human assumptions that allowed warning signs to go uninterpreted until the damage was immense. In other words, the horror does not depend on exaggeration. It is already built into the structure of the case. And maybe that's why the story refuses to disappear. It does not rely on supernatural elements, even though it can feel almost supernatural in the way it unfolds. No ghost is required. No curse. Just geography, secrecy, distorted belief, and a community slow to see what had been placed right at the edge of its vision. That kind of story lingers because it feels possible in the most uncomfortable sense. Not common, not ordinary, but possible. And when something feels possible, it stops being just a story from long ago. It becomes a warning about human systems in any era, about what people can normalize when they are isolated enough, certain enough, and left unchallenged for long enough. So why does the story of the Ozark sisters still grip people today? Because beneath the sensational surface, it speaks to fears that are timeless. The fear that people can vanish and be explained away by convenience. The fear that communities miss patterns because the truth doesn't fit their expectations. The fear that the most dangerous things are not always loud, chaotic, or obviously monstrous, but patient, organized, and hidden inside ordinary-looking places. That's why this case lands so hard in documentary form. It is not just about the sisters. It is about the systems around them, the mountains that concealed, the culture that underestimated, the silence that delayed recognition. And it is also about the rare person who refuses the easy answer. Ezra Thornton matters in this story not simply because he investigated, but because he questioned the explanation everyone else was ready to live with. In that sense, the final legacy of the case is not only horror, it is also attention, pattern recognition, the willingness to look twice at what everyone else has already dismissed. That may be the most modern lesson hidden inside this 19th century nightmare, because history is full of tragedies that lasted longer than they should have, not because no clues existed, but because no one assembled them in time. The Ozark sisters' case, whether remembered as criminal investigation, frontier atrocity, or mountain legend, endures because it captures that exact tragedy with brutal clarity. It asks what happens when danger learns how to wear the mask of isolation, and how long that mask can hold before someone finally tears it away. And maybe that is the final reason people keep returning to stories like this, not simply to be shocked, but to test a question that never fully goes away. If something this dark could hide in plain sight once, how would we know where to look the next time?